Welcome to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. In this podcast, financial planner Peter Raskin helps families and business owners understand and prepare for their wealth journey. Along the way, thoughtful and detailed planning can provide clarity and confidence as clients confront a multitude of financial decisions. Listen in as Peter shares stories and insight into people's wealth journeys. Now, let's get into today's podcast.
Hello and welcome to Wealth is in the Details with Peter Raskin from Raskin Planning Group. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Eric. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm super excited about today's show. It's not going to be an easy show for me. I'll tell you that because I'm a little emotional, just the way I am naturally. And you're talking about a pretty big deal. And you're sharing something very personal today. And I appreciate that. And I know the audience will as well. So why don't you give the audience an idea of what you're talking about?
Yeah, after a fairly long illness, my dad passed away at the end of March 26th. And when thinking about this podcast, I said, this is something I should share with my listeners because it's one of the most important things that's happened to me in my world. And I think there were, lessons to be learned and things that I could share that I thought were interesting and it's meaningful for me. So, I thought I'd pass that information on. It's funny. My dad was not one to give lots of advice or lecture. He would tend to pontificate. But but that's different than lecturing, as far as I'm concerned. He wasn't judging the people around him, but I thought I'd share kind of the things that I observed and learned over my lifetime.
Yeah, I love the way you put that because what that says to me, or what I hear in that, is that there's wisdom. Somebody who is able to do that and not pass judgment or tell somebody else what they're supposed to do, if you will. That's a lot of wisdom. You let people take from what you say what they believe they need to hear and make their own decisions and just guide along the way. And that's what it sounds like he did.
Yeah, I always felt that way. He never, I never felt judged. I always felt supported. I always felt like I was making the best decisions for me at the time. Throughout my entire life, I felt that way. So I'm very lucky in that way.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning, if you don't mind. Who was Charlie Raskin? And I say this because obviously that's your father's name, but I also hear that he went by Chuck and maybe a couple other names as well.
Yeah, people called him. Yeah, I think at different times in his life. He took on different names. So it was Charlie, Chuck, and people called him his grandkids called him Papa.
Yeah.
I called him Dad. My sister called him Dad. So those were his names. And he was just a brief background, because I don't want to get into all the details, but I think it's important to kind of frame who he was. He was born in 1919 in Yonkers, New York, which was right north of New York City. He grew up in Mount Vernon, New York. He had a small family, not a wealthy family at all. They were very, very middle class in that time. They were their background was Jewish from Eastern Europe and Russia. So they're surrounded by a small family, and that's what they had. And growing up, he seemed to have many good friends, especially in high school. And what's amazing to me is he retained these friends throughout his life. It's just fantastic that he was able to do so. It was work. He worked at it. And one of the things that I learned is that you got to work at friendship. Eventually went on to agricultural college in Pennsylvania. His parents did not go to college, but he did. And graduated. And then he went to do food testing down in Florida and on the docks of New York. Not sure exactly what he was doing with that food testing, but that was his job. And then finally, he decided he wanted to be somehow in the retail business and became a manufacturer's representative for mostly companies that distributed and sold men's accessories. like belts and ties and suspenders and wallets. Those were his lines for his 35, 40-year career. And so that's what he did. He was I call him a schlepper, because he was schlepping all over the place, all over the Northeast, really to large department stores and small department stores, and helping them sell belts and wallets and suspenders. And ties. He met my mom on a ski trip to Canada, and they married in 1957. They eventually moved to Boston, and where they resided for a year or two, and then moved to Wayland, Massachusetts, which is right west of the city, about 20 miles west of Boston. And they were together for 55 years. Seemed to have a wonderful relationship, and it was just, they were a great couple. They were a team. They had 3 kids. Unfortunately, my brother Tommy died when he was 16 and a half. And so that was a long time ago, 1977. And they worked through that. It was probably one of the hardest things that they've ever had to do, is work through the death of a child. But they did it with lots of help from their many friends and some family, because both families were small families, but got lots of help from lots and lots of people. And they did just fine, thank God. And my mom, she was wonderful, and we were lucky to have her for as long as we did. But she died 12 years ago, and so now it's just my sister and myself. So that's just a little bit of a background on my dad and our family.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: was your mom? Did she work, or was she a homemaker? Did she stay to raise the kids? I mean, it was a different time back then, and that's what the usual story is. But
yeah. My dad, he was a worker. He worked all the time, it seemed like. And my mom was home really until kind of my sister was later in elementary school. And then she started to go back to work. She worked part-time, and then she worked full-time. And she worked for probably about 20 years and had a nice career working at a university local to where they lived, Brandeis University, and worked there for a long time, and was mostly on the administrative side.
Yeah. All right, Peter, when you think of your dad, really, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of him?
I think of a life well lived, and I know that said a lot, but he just knew how to live, I think, and he wasn't perfect. There's no doubt about it, but he was just a great role model for me and for many others that were in his orbit, and that's what we kept on hearing over the last few weeks, with his funeral and his service. And is a Jewish family. We said Shiva for a few days after the funeral, and people really told us about him being such a wonderful role model to them. And I think that there were lots of reasons for that, and I thought I'd share some of those reasons that I think and that I observed, that people, and also people told us, which was really heartwarming, and that's what helps you get through these things, is remembering the good people in your life and what they've done for you.
Well, Peter, one of the things that strikes me is that before we even hit the record button today, we were talking a little bit about him, and I think you said he was 94, right?
Yeah.
And you were told stories by people that were, in his orbit, as you say, but the fact is he outlived so many people that he helped, right? I mean, I'm sure there's so many more stories that were just lost to time because he outlived probably a ton of people that he mentored, a ton of people that were just connected to him, and he grew and developed relationships with it. So I'm so happy that you have the stories that you did, but I'm just imagining the chapters and full books that could be written by all the other people that just weren't able to be there because he outlived him, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah, he did. But there were a lot of people still. There's a lot of people still left in his world, and and because he had friends who were younger than both him and my mom. They had many friends, and many of them were younger, which I think speaks to a lot about who they were.
Yeah.
And so I thought I'd share kind of those things that, why I thought it was such a great, a life well lived, and the things that I observed. And I think the first thing when I think about my dad is his optimism and his upbeat personality. You'd walk, you'd see him, and he'd give you that big hello, that big smile. He was really glad to see people. He woke up in the morning, and he was happy to be alive every day, and that was the way it always was. He was always raring to go. So optimism, I think, is, the glass was definitely half full for my dad, and it was just wonderful to be around him in that way. People don't want to be around people that are downers. They want to be
True.
They want to be people that are upbeat. And the other thing that was my dad, I'll just go down the list of the things that were, I think great about him. He was curious. He was just really curious about life, about the world. He kept on wanting to learn, and I'll talk a little bit about being a lifelong learner. But he was truly a curious person, and he loved people. He loved stories. He loved telling stories. He loved listening to stories. And so curiosity about the world and life is something that I think was very powerful for him. The other thing was curious. He evolved. He was a very different person as he grew. Like a lot of us, we all learn and grow, and we become different. But he really embraced new things. He was I wouldn't call him an early adopter, but he'd see something, and he'd want to learn about it. He'd want to figure it out. He was doing 94 years old. He just totally embraced virtual technology. He was on Zoom all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but even as a young man, my mom grew up in a different way and had different interests, and she introduced him to the arts and theater and reading. And my dad, growing up, he was more interested in playing golf and sports and partying and dating and dancing and that kind of stuff. He really didn't have a thirst for those things, but over time, he embraced it. He loved all those things.
I love that.
Yeah. And he was one to change his mind. He heard and listened. He was a bit stubborn. He was opinionated, definitely opinionated. But he did change his mind. We'd be sitting around the dining room table, at a holiday with the family, and my dad would say something. My dad was sometimes would speak before thinking.
As we all do.
As we all do. And my dad did it a lot. And he was a man of his time. And he would say something that was may not be politically correct. And we would just jump on him, and, in a friendly, loving way. And,
of course.
And we just shake our head and say, Dad, and the kids would say, Papa, you can't say that. And he'd smile and he'd say, yeah, you're right. And so he evolved. He really kept on evolving. I think that was why also people liked to be with him, because while he was opinionated, he wasn't so regimented that his mind was made up all the time. So the next one that I wrote down, and this is very important in his world, he was disciplined, especially around diet and exercise. And he was very careful about what he ate. Some of it was just like wrong, like not eating fat, was something that we were all told to do. And he totally embraced it, even the last years. And I would, at 90 years old, I'd say, Dad, have as much ice cream as you want. Mm-hmm. You're fine. So he was always very careful about what he ate. He didn't eat red meat. That was the thing he gave up. But he loved red meat. And so in the later years, we convinced him to go back to red meat. And it gave him a lot of pleasure.
Good.
And from an exercise standpoint, he was always busy physically, exercising, playing tennis, running, skiing. He introduced me to this world of physical exercise, and I embraced it, and so did my brother and my sister, and it's a big part of our lives today.
Hey,
And
did
thank
he ever get into pickleball?
No, my sister's into pickleball, but not my
Okay.
dad.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah. No, tennis was his thing, and he hasn't been able to play tennis for probably 20, 25 years because of too much running. He
Yeah.
caused back pain
Yeah.
and serious nerve pain.
That's why I was
Uh,
asking about pickleball, because I know I would never be able to play tennis even right now. And I mean, I just turned 49, Peter, but the tennis is not my thing. But man, I'm looking forward to playing some pickleball because,
yeah, yeah. It's
yeah,
supposed to be a great game. People
yeah.
love it. So diet and exercise, he was disciplined. One of the most things, the favorite things about him was he loved having fun. He loved looking forward to things like travel and to parties and to being social. He was
Hmm.
very, very social. Um, and he loved to be around funny people that made him laugh. He just loved it. It, it was really important, very important part of his world, being with other people and having fun.
Mm.
Um, and so, well, I've said this to people. He was. I think he'd enter a room and people would say, "Oh, you brighten the room because you're always smiling, you're always happy," and I don't think that's what happened. I think that the people in the room brightened my dad.
Mm.
He just loved being with others. Um, so he had a lot of fun, but even despite, his desire to have fun, he worked really hard. He worked hard at business. He worked hard at maintaining friend and family connections.
Mm.
This was really important to him, and he wanted to. He was a hard worker, like a lot of people from that generation. They just did it. He was self-reliant, both socially as well as employment is concerned, work. It's something he enjoyed doing. He enjoyed working, he enjoyed being with friends, and he knew he had to make an effort for both. He was always in motion, either working or working in his business or around the house, mowing the lawn, painting.
Hmm.
He'd paint a side of our little Cape house. Every year he'd paint a side. Um, you know, doing yard work, cutting wood because he had a wood stove for years, and he'd have 5 cords of wood dumped on the front lawn, and he'd spend the summer cutting it.
Mm.
It was
Wow.
crazy. Uh, he was a lifelong learner. He loved to be with people that were interested in the world. He loved serious questions, discussions. He and my mom, they in their retirement years, they joined an adult learning program at Brandeis University, which was, again, close where they lived. And he took classes. He took 2, 3 classes a year, or I mean, sorry, a semester.
Mm.
And it became a big part of his social life. It just, he's taking classes up till the end. Loved it. He was involved in his temple, and he'd go to Torah study on Saturday mornings, and a very important part of his world. He just loved the discussions about Torah, and he wasn't a religious person, but he loved the conversation around it. He loved history. He was very proud of his religious upbringing and what it meant to him, and he wanted to share that with others. Um, so lifelong learner. The other thing I think that was such a focus for him was community. He
Mm.
loved being with friends. He loved being at his temple. They were members of organizations like a play reading group. He was actively involved in housing authority and the council on aging in his town. He was very active there, and again, he did the adult learning. So these communities were vital to him. It was lifted him, and I think what a great example to stay engaged across many different groups. And that's why I think so many people were at his memorial service. As I mentioned to you earlier, there were well over 100 people for a 94-year-old. That's pretty
Wow.
good.
Yeah.
because I think he was engaged with so many different communities and so many different people. Um, and then lastly, one of the things I observed uh, from him, and so important to me, is that he was good to my mom. He was gentle. He was a good guy. He was considerate. In some ways, he wasn't always perfect from that perspective, but he was good to my mom. And after my mom passed, he really wanted companionship and was blessed to have been introduced to another woman, a peer of his, and they had a wonderful relationship. And he was good to her. She was also very good to him. So it was just very nice. He, and that's a great example, to be good to the people, your loved one. It's so important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, this is Catherine Broy from the Raskin Planning Group. Apologies for the interruption. Thanks so much for listening to Wealth is in the Details. We hope you're enjoying it so far. If you have any questions or would like to talk more about this topic, please visit our website at www.raskinplanning.com. Look for the podcast's show notes and connect with us via social media.
Now, and I know that you've talked on the show many times about age differences and spouses and different times that people pass away. Somebody's going to outlive somebody else. And obviously that was your dad in this case, which is actually more rare, right? Usually it's the woman that lives longer. But I'm curious, did your mom and dad have a financial planner? Did they embrace planning? Did they get obviously having a son that's a financial planner that can, probably gave them some pretty doggone good advice through the years. But did they do that even before maybe you were in the role that you're in now?
Yeah, they did. They did. They didn't embrace formal financial planning. Frankly, my folks, they did well enough financially. They didn't have a lot. They owned a home. They had some savings. They had some inheritance from my mom's family, which wasn't very much, and it was there to support my mom's mom and my mom's brother, who had been disabled. So it was necessary that those funds be well maintained and invested. And they did have someone, a family friend, do that. And then I came into business.
Yeah.
And so I became their financial advisor. And
well, I didn't want to ask that question, but yes, I'm glad that that's the result.
And I work with their other professionals, their accountant, who was like an uncle to me, and their attorney, and they did what needed to be done, and they took my advice. And one of the things that I think I learned is to accept professional advice. That's not always easy for people, to be trusting enough to accept the advice from others. Not everyone does that. So I learned that. That was something I learned. So yeah, they did have a financial planner. I think a good one, but that's just my personal opinion.
I would agree.
Yeah. And some of the lessons I learned and observed from my folks, because my mom was integral in this team, but a lot of the on the prudent side of life came from my dad. You just, again, it's generational. He didn't come from a lot, and he didn't spend it until he had it.
Yeah.
He really didn't.
That's great.
He was careful. We never really talked about not having a lot. I did know my mom wanted to do, go on more vacation and things like that. But my dad, they didn't really, I never heard them arguing about money. It wasn't an issue around the house. But it was known that we just didn't have that much. We just, you don't spend it until you have it. And so I observed that from the get-go. And I over time, and especially when I became their advisor, my dad saved when he could. He at a point in life, he was self-employed, and he was able to establish a pension plan for himself, which allowed him to sock away some money, especially in those higher earning years. And so he saved when he could. They never went into debt. They never had debt. And I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah.
He, while they didn't have a lot, my dad, he drove all over the place. He drove 50,000 miles a year. That's a lot of mileage on your car.
Yeah.
And my dad realized that he had to buy quality cars, not just because he liked driving them, but more importantly, it was comfortable. He was in that office all day long. It was a health issue, and also it became a financial issue. He wanted to buy quality cars, drive them a long time. He changed the oil. I remember him under that car changing the oil every 3,000 miles. He did it himself. He'd walk around turning off the lights, and I still do the same thing. It drives everyone crazy. He turned off the heat. As I mentioned, he cut that firewood so we could have the wood burning stove go. Especially my mom and my sister were walking around in down coats around the house. So he's very, very prudent. They didn't live large. They didn't have a second home. They had lots of friends who invited them to their second homes, and they took full advantage of that. Their vacations were modest, and my dad was a do-it-yourselfer. He was painting, he was mowing the lawn. As I mentioned, that's what he did around the house.
Yeah.
So prudent. He was a prudent steward of the family income and assets. That's how I would describe him.
Yeah, I think that your dad, and I would get along very well, because I've said to my wife many times, you can always put more clothes on. I can only take so many off before it becomes embarrassing. So
right.
The heat's not going up to 72. I'm sorry. I'll be sweating, and it needs to stay at a good even temperature. Put on a sweater.
Exactly. So that was a big part of his financial world, is just being careful.
Yeah, that's
the
great.
other thing my dad did is it's not that he was a great believer in insurance, but he accepted the fact that insurance is part of life. One of his best buddies was a insurance agent, life insurance agent, a very successful guy. My dad bought a lot of life insurance from him. He always had homeowners insurance, umbrella insurance, medical insurance. He had all of that. He bought long-term care insurance, 25, 30 years ago.
Wow,
and so thank goodness that he did. They spent a lot of years paying premiums, both my mom and dad. My mom passed away before she could make a claim, but my dad was making a claim. The last 6 months, he was receiving 24-hour-a-day care, and because of there's an elimination period with long-term care insurance, it eventually paid. And whether he got his money's worth, I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter, but it gave him peace of mind. It gave my sister and myself peace of mind, and we were able to bring in as much help as we needed, and that was great. Thank goodness.
Yeah, well, I think that probably his primary objective, I'm not speaking for him, but when you've spoken about this before, really one of the primary objectives is, I don't want my kids to have to pay for this kind of stuff, this kind of care, because we know, especially now, it's super expensive. So when he bought his policy 20, 25 years ago, those premiums weren't nearly as much as they would be today, but look at all the, look at what he did for his entire family, for his son and his daughter. They didn't have to shoulder that burden.
We didn't have to think about it, and he had other resources, so it just wasn't an issue. He was happy about that. It felt good to him, and it felt good to my sister and myself that we were able to provide that for him.
Yeah.
It was vital.
Awesome.
Yeah. And along the same lines, I think he had an attitude of that you should expect the unexpected, and that you have to plan for it. And I think, maybe some of that came from my brother's illness and subsequent passing, when out of the blue when he was 16. But my dad always said, we're all sitting on that fence post, and it doesn't take much to blow you off. And I think that's one reason I have always loved what I do, financial planning, because I help our clients understand that that life is full of unexpected events. It just happens, and it's not good or bad. It just is, and we got to think about that. My dad, he didn't dwell on it. It wasn't a negative for him. My brother's passing was absolutely, but just he wasn't fearful. He said, "You just expect this is going to happen. Something's going to happen.
Something's going to happen." Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a big part of what I learned from him and the way they reacted to my brother's passing is that just this stuff, unfortunately, is part of life. So another thing, I think is very clear. Again, I think it's somewhat generational, but my dad was just very self-reliant. Just, if it was going to come from any place, it was going to come from their own actions. My mom working, my dad working, their own plan, being thoughtful and planning ahead, thinking of others. They were relying on themselves to do it. And they reached out and got support. As I mentioned, they both trusted professionals and accepted advice. And I think that was, they were easy to work with from that perspective. And my dad was very practical. That's another financial advantage, I think. He was very practical. He was always thinking ahead. Just an example, after my mom died, he stayed in the house for about a year. And then he realized this is not going to cut it. He just couldn't get up on the roof any longer and shovel snow off the roof. It wasn't going to happen in his early 80s.
Yeah.
And so he downsized, and my mom and dad were actually looking to downsize before she got sick and passed. But he took action. He went into an independent living facility. It was basically an apartment house that offered a social life. It offered meals. It was safe. It was new. It was practical. He could still be independent. He was driving all over the place for all those years. Very independent. But it was a place where he could come back and have dinner with people, and it was very important. It was a great community for him. So it's not that everyone needs to do that, but he was thoughtful about why he was doing it and was willing to give up his previous world in the town that he'd lived in for well over 55 years. He did things like he updated his will, his power of attorney, healthcare proxy. He wanted to do those things, make sure that they were current. He was also he was practical in the sense that he wanted to share with us his feelings about the end. And he's been doing this for years. It was not just the last months. He was for years telling us about his feelings about how he wanted to leave this world.
Yeah.
He didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to be a burden. Those were vital and important values for him. And he was expressed it time and again. And we had no doubts about how he wanted to live out his last days. It's just, there was no doubt. And that was a great relief. He shared with us, his plan. He shared with us his passwords for all of his websites, his bank accounts, and he just made it easy. I wouldn't say he was the most organized person, but he showed us where things were, and we have figured it out. Over these last bunch of months, but thank goodness he was an open book around all that. He felt like he was in good hands. He'd done his best, and here he is. And he just wanted to help us. He just didn't want to be a burden. And so those are the things that I observed over my lifetime as both his financial advisor and his son. And I'm really appreciative of how what he did and my mom did, over those years. And I thought I'd share that. I thought they were good lessons for me, and for our listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we've spoken about your dad before, and you've told me other stories off air, when we've been speaking, and through all this, it seems to me you were very lucky to have a wonderful mentor. And I want to know, with your role as an advisor, I know that you're always teaching, but how are you educating your kids about financial affairs based on kind of what they've experienced with their grandfather?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've been perfect around this subject. My kids are in their mid and early 30s, so they're young adults. They're off on their own doing their own thing, and they're all great people, and they're figuring out their world, and we're really proud of them. And as they were growing up, I kind of hoped that they would learn like I did, that they would observe my wife and myself and use us as an example. And for the most part, I think they have. All three are around financial issues. All three are careful and respectful about money, and they take it seriously. And they live carefully and prudently, and sometimes I wish they'd lighten up a little bit and have not be penny wise and pound foolish, which I've been accused of and have been guilty of over my lifetime, and so is my dad. So that's the other side of being overly prudent. So I didn't sit them down and say, this is a checking account, this is a credit card, and this is what you should avoid and not avoid. Maybe I should have done more of that. My kids are educated. They know about the world. They're very careful. They're good stewards of their own income and wealth. But I have not educated them around all of those details around wealth. I call this podcast, the wealth is in the details. Well, my kids don't have a lot of wealth at this point in time. Mm-hmm. I probably should have been educating them more over the years, but I haven't. I've been their dad and not their financial planner first. And so in hindsight, I wish I'd done a little bit more lecturing around those issues and teaching, but that's not who I am. And I'm not sure that's who they wanted me to be. When my daughter has had financial planning questions, and she's asked, but she didn't feel comfortable talking to me, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I think that's great that she would be able to tell me that. I referred her to Catherine Broy in my office, who's a CFP, and she's wonderful, and she's smart, and she's great, and all those things. And I told both of them that if they did chat, that conversation was confidential. And they did have a good conversation, and I think it was really helpful. And if they ever want to get more serious, or there's other things they wanted and they didn't want me involved in their financial world, I would definitely refer them to others if they wanted. So it's really up to them. It's kind of like it is our clients. I leave it up to them. When they're ready, they'll ask for help.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think we find that in every family. It doesn't matter how good the parents are. There's certain times that you just want to talk to somebody else, and maybe there's just some privacy stuff or a little bit of embarrassment. Maybe you've made some mistakes. You don't want to tell dad. But I love the fact that you've got Catherine there, and she's a great resource. But that also leads me to one of my last questions as far as this podcast. What about your clients' kids? I mean, that's something that you have spoken about, multi-generational wealth and multi-generational planning. What about the clients' kids at this point?
Yeah, I love helping and being involved with our clients' kids. To me, it's one of the most satisfying. Most satisfying work that we do. They're great people. They're interested. If they may have their own financial advisor, and that's great too. But I love being introduced to our clients' kids and helping them, and that gives our clients such a great sense of security. And that their kids are taken care of, well, and they can trust us. So it's really, we love doing that, and we do it a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put a link in the podcast notes for how you can reach Peter and his team. I'm not going to ask Peter for that because I think this is a great way to close today's podcast. I have just gained a much greater appreciation for Charlie Raskin, Chuck. As you've said, he brought up a great man that I'm so blessed to be a part of the show, Peter, with you, and I've learned a ton from you, just like you learned a ton from your father. So I appreciate you as well, and I appreciate you sharing today.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah,
It felt good and right to talk about my dad, and I hope many of our listeners are lucky enough to have someone in their life like that. It's a great blessing.
All right. Fantastic. Peter, again, thank you so much today.
Thanks, Eric. Bye-bye.
You bet. And last thank you goes to you, listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast with Peter Raskin. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Peter comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. We humbly ask that you share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this actually does help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Raskin Planning Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Lincoln Financial Advisors Corp. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. Peter Raskin is a registered representative of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Securities offered through Lincoln Financial Advisors Corp., a broker-dealer, member SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SageMark Consulting, a division of Lincoln Financial Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Insurance offered through Lincoln Affiliates and other fine companies. Raskin Planning Group is a marketing name for registered representatives of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation and its representatives do not provide legal or tax advice. You may want to consult a legal or tax advisor regarding any legal or tax information as it relates to your personal circumstances.